So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Extremely happy to introduce our guest speaker for today. He is, many of you know him actually because he spent a good, 10 years-ish at Columbia as a PhD student and worked with many of us here. And then went on to a position in Taiwan at the Guoli Zhengzhi Daxue, right, the National Chengchi University, as an assistant professor, and he has since returned from being overseas and is now a policy analyst in the Security and Foreign Affairs with the U.S. and China Economic and Security Review Commission. He's also been, while moving into policy work, has also recently published, he continues with his scholarship, and he's also recently published a book that he's going to speak on today that he started here at Columbia that I know well. This is a great project. I remember actually the first seminar where you started exploring this project. That was probably over 10 years ago, 12 years ago. In any case, but it has evolved to a book. So I'm really happy myself to kind of learn about the book itself. The book is titled The Adoption Plan, China and the Remaking of Global Humanitarianism. And let's welcome Jack Neubauer.
Okay, let's see how I do on the tech side, getting this set up. Share, PowerPoint slideshow. And I think I'm in slideshow mode, right, Joy? Great. So thank you so much to the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and Julie for organizing and hosting today's event. And I also want to thank Eugenia both for moderating today's talk and supporting me in this project over so many years. As Eugenia mentioned, this book, the seeds of this book began as a seminar paper in a research seminar with Eugenia back in, I think it was 2013, a long time ago. And certainly without Eugenia's tireless support over so many years, it would never have evolved into a book. So the adoption plan tells the story of how the cause of saving the children in China ignited a new global humanitarian imagination and precipitated an intense transnational struggle to control the vast quantities of aid that flowed into China on these children's behalf. That's right, quick. Looks great. So along with the rising sort of popularity of global history more generally over the past 20-ish years, the history of humanitarianism has really emerged. Am I doing everything right tech-wise? Okay, great. Amazing. Thank you so much. So alongside the rise of global history as sort of a popular field, the history of humanitarianism has really emerged as a pretty important and popular subfield in historical research. I think scholars have been particularly interested in this question of the relationship between humanitarianism and imperialism. As Western empires spread across the world, they embrace sort of this ideology of colonial benevolence, in which they at least said that they were going to engage in humanitarian projects like building orphanages, schools, and hospitals in their far-flung colonies. And so, as a lot of critical scholars have pointed out, humanitarian projects, in a sense, provided moral cover for imperialist exploitation by making vulnerable populations in places like Asia and Africa dependent upon imperialist largesse. And the handful of studies that have specifically looked at these case studies of international adoption or child sponsorship, I think make a version of this argument, often arguing that in the case of, say, international adoption and child sponsorship in 20th century East Asia, that they emerged as tools of US Cold War foreign policy by making the United States' expansive military and economic presence in East Asia appear benevolent and naturalized. Methodologically, most of these studies rely on the Western language archives of international humanitarian organizations, and because of that are sort of necessarily limited to analyzing the ideological, economic, or geopolitical motives sort of shaping the rise of these humanitarian projects. But historians have paid a lot less attention to the perspectives of the recipients of humanitarian aid in the non-Western world. And as a result, I think this body of scholarship as a whole tends to reinforce this perspective that only the sort of motives of the would-be rescuers matter. A hard time moving forward. Let's see if I can. There we go. So instead, the adoption plan asks a different question. It asks, how might the history of humanitarianism look differently if told from the perspective of the recipients of aid in China? And in particular, I think when we use Chinese archives and look down at the recipient's perspective, a sort of bottom-up approach to global humanitarianism, we learn quite a lot about three sort of key transformations in the overall global history of humanitarianism. One, I think we get a new perspective on the globalization of humanitarianism, one that sees humanitarianism not just as an expansion of pre-existing colonial practices, but shows how China's semi-colonial status and the role of the global Chinese diaspora really helped create a new theory and practice of global humanitarianism. And one that also sheds light on the personalization of humanitarianism by showing how these China-based organizations cultivated personal ties between foreign donors and Chinese children as a strategy for attracting aid in this newly competitive global marketplace for humanitarian resources and attention. And finally, I think it reveals something new about the politics of humanitarian aid and really challenges the conventional narrative that humanitarian aid served as a vector of imperialism or of Western influence, to instead show that it was actually often the recipients of aid in China who were best able to control both its practical and its political uses for their own projects. So what I want to do in this talk today is try to sketch out the sort of alternative history of global humanitarianism, and do so through the stories of 4 individual Chinese children. We'll talk about the birth of global humanitarianism, global humanitarianism's intimate turn, the rise and fall of revolutionary humanitarianism, and finally, humanitarianism in the Cold War, through the perspectives and the sources produced by these 4 children. So we'll start with the birth of global humanitarianism and the story of a boy named Kuo Hua. So Kuo Hua was born on Hainan Island in South China in 1934. After Japan invaded Hainan Island, along with his 2 older brothers, he fled north and eventually ended up in an orphanage about 140 kilometers north of Guangzhou Bay, operated by a Chinese organization called the National Association for Refugee Children, the largest child welfare organization in wartime China, headed by the First Lady of Nationalist China, Madam Chiang Kai-shek. How do I know this? I know this because it's contained in a letter, this letter that you see in front of you, that Kuo Hua wrote to a woman named Hilda in Auckland, New Zealand in January 1941. Now, if you're doing the math, Kuo Hua was about 6 years old at the time, so even though this letter is written in first person as Kuo Hua, he did not actually write this one, and actually, as it kind of earnestly admits at the end of the letter, one of his older brothers who was in the same orphanage helped him write out this letter to Hilda. So Hilda, for her part, had agreed to sponsor Kuo Hua through something called the Adoption Plan for International Child Sponsorship. And a little bit earlier, Hilda had actually first written to Kuo Hua this letter that you see here, where she asks him to call her Auntie Hilda and says she's adopted you through the sponsorship program run by Madam Chiang Kai-shek, acknowledges that she's received a photograph of Kuo Hua, and says that she would just like to take him in his arms and give him a big hug. So I think there's a lot to unpack here, right? About sponsorship, about translation, about letter writing, and about war. But before we get to all that, and I promise we'll get to all of that, I want to step back and ask the question of how it came to be that a woman like Hilda in New Zealand was sending humanitarian aid to a child like Kuo Hua in China. Because I think the answer to that question requires unpacking this new form of global humanitarian aid campaign that had taken shape around the cause of saving Chinese children over the past 100 years. So stepping back for a second, what is humanitarianism? I think I follow a lot of scholars in defining humanitarianism quite broadly. as activism on behalf of distant strangers. The sort of general consensus is humanitarian practices emerged around the abolitionist movement in the late 18th and 19th century. But as I mentioned at the beginning, humanitarianism in the early 19th century was very closely tied to this idea of colonial benevolences. European empires, at least in theory, acknowledged that they had a responsibility to alleviate the suffering of their subjects. So even though humanitarianism used this universal language, in practice, early humanitarian campaigns were almost always confined within the boundaries of individual empires. People in France donated to humanitarian causes in French colonies, people in Britain donated to humanitarian causes in British colonies, etc. The moral universe of early humanitarianism was not really the world or the globe, but the empire. At the same time, something new was happening in China. What I argue in the book is that a new global humanitarian practice was taking shape around the specific cause of saving the children in China. And I argue that that happened really for two main reasons. The first, the sort of unique nature of semi-colonialism in China, and second, the global Chinese diaspora. So on the first, on semi-colonialism, China, unlike, say, British India or French Indochina, was never colonized by a single colonial power. Instead, many different imperialist powers signed unequal treaties that enabled them to economically exploit areas of China without actually taking on any of the obligations of running an official colonial government. As a result, there was no foreign power that acknowledged any kind of colonial responsibility to China. When famines broke out in India, for example, there was at least the expectation that the British colonial government and the British public would step in and help out, an expectation often honored in the breach. Nothing like that, existed in China. No foreign power saw it as their particular duty to contribute to humanitarian causes in China. So instead, a new pattern emerged in which humanitarian causes in China start to attract support from private voluntary organizations funded by individual donors across much of the world because so many different countries had interest in semi-colonial China. So just to give one, I think, familiar example that illustrates the point, one of the first, you could call an international NGO in China, the Holy Childhood Association, founded in France in 1843, supports the work of Catholic missionaries doing things like child rescue in China, but is fundraised by encouraging regular small donations from a pretty global donor base. If we look just at 1 year, at 1899 to 1900, we can see how truly global the Holy Childhood Association's fundraising was, getting donations from virtually every country that had signed unequal treaties with China and the other colonial possessions of those countries around the world. So in a way, it's precisely because no particular colonial power claims this colonial benevolence toward China that we see the emergence of a new global humanitarian fundraising campaign that is private and voluntary. The other factor is the global Chinese diaspora. So if we go back to the National Association for Refugee Children, the NARC, this organization through which Hilda had adopted Kuohua, largest child welfare organization in World War II China, operates more than 61, they called them orphanages. Almost all of its fundraising was from private sources from abroad, and they're really working through Chinese diasporic groups. So the NARC in Chongqing would reach out to elite diasporic Chinese in places like New Zealand or France, across Southeast Asia and across the United States to make those connections. So Song Meiling in Chongqing had written to some prominent Chinese women in New Zealand. Those Chinese women in New Zealand were the ones who got people like Hilda interested in donating to Chinese children. So here you see something, again, quite different than I think the story of colonial expansion as a mode of humanitarian dispersion, and instead seeing Chinese organizations working through Chinese diasporic networks to make China a global humanitarian cause. And if you actually look at sort of the early fundraising records from the NRSC, where they're getting these sponsorships from really tracks places where there are sort of thriving elite Chinese diasporic communities. So over this basically 100-year period, basically from the Opium War to the Pacific War, we see this inchoate global humanitarian system take shape in China, one that relies on large numbers of small donations from individuals and private organizations who essentially acknowledged no ties to these Chinese children except for their shared humanity, essentially making the Chinese child, someone like Huo Hua, into a symbol of humanity qua humanity. And this very much anticipates the kind of private global humanitarian campaigns that are par for the course in response to humanitarian disasters today. They're global in scope, universal in framing, voluntary in character, and we also need to acknowledge grossly inadequate in practice. But the globalization of humanitarian aid also causes this kind of problem that I call the everyone, everywhere, all at once problem, right? Essentially, if suffering people everywhere on Earth are equally worthy of sympathy and help, then how is a would-be humanitarian, how is someone like Hilda supposed to decide where specifically to give her limited resources, right? The amount of suffering in the world is just too great, and you can't help everyone, everywhere, all at once. So I think this is the problem the NRC really faces, right? How to navigate this competitive global marketplace for humanitarian attention. And to see how they do, let's turn to the second story, the story of Qiming and global humanitarianism's intimate turn. So on December 1st, 1939, a woman named Gladys, she was from the dairy farming district of Matamata, New Zealand, not too far from Hilda, wrote this letter to a Chinese boy named Qiming. She said, it will be strange for you to receive a letter from New Zealand, and you will wonder about the people who are writing to you. Introduces herself, and then concludes by saying, this, our first letter, is to welcome you into our family. So, like Hilda, Gladys had sponsored Chinese child Qiming through what eventually became known as the Adoption Plan for International Child Sponsorship. This was the most popular fundraising method that the NARC was using in China, in which foreign sponsors would pay for children to live in local orphanages, build these personal relationships through the exchange of letters, translated letters, gifts, and photographs, and then also use this sort of metaphor of adoption and these familial terms of address. This remains, although without the adoption metaphor, child sponsorship remains probably the most successful private humanitarian fundraising strategy across the world today. I like Gladys's letter because I think it's pretty self-aware in acknowledging how strange it must be, right, for Qiming to get this letter from a woman whom he doesn't know and clearly knows little about him and yet claims to be his foster mother. And she wasn't wrong. If we look back at Kuo Hua's letter that his brother helped him write, he told Hilda, when I was playing most happily, a child came in from outside carrying the letter and the lovely picture you gave me. And at first, I simply could not understand what was really going on, really acknowledging that confusion. Nevertheless, at least in some cases, both sponsors and Chinese children really tried to make meaningful epistolary relationships work. Gladys concludes her letter by saying, now we think of you as our foster son and send you our love as we would if you were our son indeed. You know, was thinking much about you and eagerly await news. And Kuo Hua, who was initially confused, concludes by saying, after his friends explained what was really happening, he found out that you have already adopted me as your foster son. This made me very delighted. So I think the adoption plan really became one of the sort of key emblems of this broader intimate turn in global humanitarian practice that used new transportation and communication technologies to build these effective and material ties, right, between the givers of aid and the receivers of aid across geographic, but also cultural and linguistic and racial boundaries. In a sense, I would argue that child sponsorship has been so successful as a fundraising strategy because it solves the everyone, everywhere, all at once problem, right? Child sponsorship, this idea that you have a personal obligation to an individual child, gave people like Gladys a reason to donate and keep donating to this one child in China, despite the potentially infinite number of worthy causes competing for her attention. But this is easier said than done, right? How do you actually logistically follow through on this promise to build meaningful relationships across national and linguistic lines? If nothing else, these child sponsorship organizations tried quite hard to make this work. Another one of them, China's Children Fund, what's Child Fund today, they would actually produce these children's magazines, sort of giving children training in how to write letters to foreign sponsors. This is just one example article where they kind of acknowledge, right, this is not an easy task, right? It's not even easy to, pick up your pens and write letters to your family in China, let alone to find the words to say to foreign friends. And then different articles would sort of give different pieces of advice, right? How can you do this in a way that's meaningful? And they give things like, saying Americans always describe things in detail. For example, if your friend has headaches, you can ask about the headaches, and you don't have to use these kind of stock conventional phrases that they might have been taught to do in a letter writing class in China, such as, I have heard recently that your honorable body is indisposed. I think it was 今文贵体为何. And when there were inevitably sort of awkwardnesses in these letters, they could always turn to translation as this kind of technology of translingual intimacy. This is one example I think is quite interesting. The original letter, the student actually says, I only regret that I am slow-witted by nature and that my progress in both my studies and work lags far behind. And I think perhaps fearing that this would not translate so well into English, that's the literal translation of the Chinese, or perhaps even fearing that the sponsors would wonder why their precious donation was being used on a child with not a lot of natural aptitude. It's simply removed from the actual English language translation that they sent to the sponsor, which only says, I hope you will pray for our progress. So the NARC, they could teach children how to write letters, they could massage them in translation, but actually facilitating this exchange of letters was a whole nother matter. So let's return one more time to this letter that Gladys sent to Qiming. It turns out he never actually received it. A few months later, in April 1940, Gladys received a letter back from the NARC in Chongqing saying, we received your letter, but Qiming has already been reunited with his family, and so we're gonna hold your letter and we wanna give it to this other boy, Chen Shi, who's 13. Sounds nice. This was not, in fact, true. Gladys' letter was actually received in Chongqing. It was translated into Chinese, and it was sent to the orphanage where Qiming resided. But in fact, the superintendent of that orphanage wrote back to say, is that child fled the orphanage back in October 1939, and we don't know where he went. We can't give you his letter. But instead of telling the uncomfortable truth that children were often running away from these poorly staffed orphanages in a chaotic time of war, they instead made up the white lie that he had been reunited with his family. And in fact, so Gladys agreed, and in fact they actually did eventually, almost a year and a half later, send Gladys back a letter from her new adopted child, Chen Shi. As far as I can tell, the NARC always did ask permission to change out children, but this idea of Chinese children being interchangeable, I think, sort of reveals some of the problems, right, that were emerging from trying to use intimacy as a mode of humanitarian fundraising. There's another case I found in the archives in China where a letter from a woman named Alice to her original sponsored child, Cheng Guangfu. You can see that they just crossed out the name in the Chinese translation and wrote in beside it the name of her new adopted child, Yang Xueren. So why even continue with this, right? If the logistics are so hard, why is the NARC even trying to get these letters back to begin with? One was its fundraising power. They found people were way more likely to donate. But the other is political. The NARC, affiliated with Song Meiling and the Chinese Nationalist Party, really saw this as a powerful tool for building sympathy for China in its struggle against Japan during World War II, and for promoting the heroism of the Nationalist Party through these letters, and hoping that these donors, particularly before Pearl Harbor, would in turn agitate for their governments to support China more forcefully. And so I think the NARC might have actually been the first organization to really appreciate how the personalization of humanitarian aid transformed its political possibilities. But they would not be the last. In fact, it was the Chinese communists around the revolution of 1949 who I think really fully came to appreciate the political possibilities of this new form of global humanitarianism. So for that story, let's turn to Qin Chuan and the rise of revolutionary humanitarianism. So in 1949, the American family who had sponsored Qinchuan through a similar adoption plan, this one operated by the China branch of Foster Parents Plan for War Children, PLAN as it was known for short, they received this case file about Qinchuan, and they would have learned that he was living in the Chenyun school, and under the care of this responsible person, one Si Qianqiao. That name probably did not mean anything, right, to the American foster parents of Qinchuan. But in fact, his caretaker was none other than Shi Jianqiao, the famous female assassin who had assassinated the warlord Sun Chunfang back in 1935. And after she was released from prison, sort of became interested in patriotic fundraising campaigns during the war and fell in with this group of left-wing activists, someone that many people in the field are familiar with thanks to the pioneering work of Eugenia. And the Plan China branch was well aware of who Shi Jianqiao was, and they actually openly celebrated their connection to Shi Jianqiao in their Chinese language publicity materials. They published this poem saying, "Learn from Big Sister Shi," that actually encouraged children to emulate her spirit of fighting against feudal reactionaries, although they didn't explicitly tell children to go out and assassinate warlords. So in a lot of ways, this is a unique case, right? As far as I know, this was the only case of an orphanage funded by the adoption plan that was operated by an infamous assassin. But in other ways, it was pretty, I think, emblematic of the ways that around the time of the Chinese Communist Revolution, the communists tried to take the adoption plan and transform it into this new mode of revolutionary humanitarianism. And at the center of this is the Plan China branch. Plan was a pretty left-leaning, secular international humanitarian organization. Its roots are actually in the Spanish Civil War and the sort of anti-fascist United Front progressive politics. In the 40s, they move into China and fall in with these sort of same progressive circles. They partner up with Song Qingling's China Welfare Fund, and they end up supporting 27 progressive child welfare institutions that have very close ties to the underground Chinese Communist Party, organizations like Shi Jianqiao's Chenyun School. But it's not just channeling money to progressive child welfare organizations. They also have this idea of transforming children into people's diplomats by having them write letters that basically explain how their lives have benefited from the Communist Revolution and how they suffered under the American allied nationalist reactionaries. And in their Chinese language sort of publicity, they're very explicit about the political aspects underlying this. They ask, how can we take the exchange of ordinary pleasantries and dull greetings and transform them into people's diplomacy and international propaganda? They suggest all these topics that children can write about, like the construction of New China or the glorious achievements of the People's Liberation Army, also all the evil things done by the nationalist reactionaries. But they're also very sensitive to the idea that these letters are only going to work, right, as people's diplomacy or political propaganda if they're actually rooted in affectionate ties between children and their sponsors, in this case, largely in the United States. They want this to create sentiment across national boundaries. They call it 国际间的情感, or what I sort of render more loosely as global intimacy. And so to do this, they actually really have to get in the weeds, right, of teaching children how to write these letters, right? They can't be too openly propagandistic. They need to be soft in tone, but firm in substance. 外软内硬. And they eventually sort of consolidate this in their internal documents into this idea of using the heart to influence the mind, right? 从感情到理性的宣传法. Some children are actually quite good at this. This is an example from a girl named In Ho, where she begins her letter saying, "It is too bad that we cannot open our mouths and speak to each other directly, but can only use this piece of white paper to say all that is in our hearts." But as it turns out, what she would like to share with her foster mother are all these positive changes she's seen since the People's Liberation Army had liberated Shanghai 1 month earlier, how the farmers were now getting fertilizer and rice, and the soldiers are kind to the people. And she concludes by saying that the day before yesterday, the nationalists, right, the American allied nationalists had sent planes to come and drop bombs on the city. This is true. And she mentions that one of her classmates' homes was ruined in the bombing. So I don't know what you all think. I think as far as doing, writing letters that are soft in tone but firm in substance and using the heart to influence the mind, I think Yin Ho does pretty well. I think this is pretty impressive. Not all of the children were such skillful letter writers. the Planned China branch had a big problem with letters that started to go off script. They complained in internal documents, we don't have enough control, right, over the children's letters, right? Their political level is very high, but their propaganda skills are poor, and this is starting to hurt the sentiments of these American foster parents. They gave examples like children decrying American imperialism and lecturing to their sponsors, displaying I love this, the erroneous tendencies of excessively harsh language or excessively leftist ideology. So what to do? Like the NRC before them, they turned to translation as a mode of political censorship. So here's one example where in the initial Chinese letter, a sort of literal translation would read, "The people in the Soviet Union are very happy, and it is only under Stalin's leadership that they are able to live in happiness," right? So China must try to emulate them. Don't you agree? The corresponding section of the English language translation that was actually sent to this boy's foster parents tones it down a lot, right? It only says, "It is our belief that when the government is in the hands of the people are able to enjoy their happiness and peaceful living." So I think quite clear, and there's so many examples like this in the archives, that even though they wanted to make these letters a tool of diplomacy and propaganda, they were very worried about children taking it too far, right, and undermining the affective basis of this form of people's diplomacy. By the time that the People's Liberation Army had liberated Shanghai in May 1949, many of the older children at these Planned China branch institutions actually ended up signing up for the PLA and going into the army. And this boy, Guanchun, was one of them. And this is the last letter that he wrote to his foster parents. They were called the Macaulays, in June 49, explaining how excited he was to join the army. And about 14 months later, he would find himself actually on the battlefield in Korea, fighting against the United States, right, the compatriots of his former foster parents. And during that, as China was retreating back toward the 38th parallel, he was actually caught in a napalm bombing and died, something that was not known until one of his compatriots at the orphanage was able to look into the archives and find his file and the coordinates of his death in Korea. So you can see how the sort of initial promise of revolutionary humanitarianism sort of really crumbled against the hard realities of war. And so while the Chinese Communist Party was at least briefly, right, willing to explore this mode of humanitarian cooperation with largely with the United States as a tool of people's diplomacy, once China and the United States were literally at war in Korea, everything would change once again. And so for the final part of the talk, the rise of Cold War humanitarianism, I want to turn to the story of Erxiang. So Erxiang was at a very different kind of orphanage. He was at an orphanage called Chang Memorial Children's Village, so named because it was actually located in the former wartime residence of Chiang Kai-shek and Song Meiling in the sort of picturesque hills overlooking the Yangtze River outside of Chongqing. It was run by Southern Baptist missionaries, headed by this American named J.R. Saunders, and was also funded by the adoption plan through this group called the American Oriental Friendship Association. So same fundraising strategy, same tool of sort of using these intimate ties to build humanitarian connections, but politically a mile away, right? Run by conservative American Christians, affiliated with Chiang Kai-shek, very different than these progressive institutions being operated by Plan. And in fact, by the outbreak of the Korean War, this initial idea of revolutionary humanitarianism, of turning children into people's diplomats, had really started to fall apart. Instead, what it appeared that the adoption plan was doing was making Chinese children both emotionally and economically dependent upon China's new ideological and material and sort of military enemy, the United States. And so it's really only at this point that Chinese Marxists really embrace these traditional Marxist critiques of humanitarianism as a kind of cultural invasion or instilling a slave-like mentality in the Chinese people. And they actually specifically attack these orphanages funded by the adoption plan as doing this false ideological education to make children resent their biological parents, resent society, and resent their own fatherland. And in part because it's associated with the nationalist, Chang Memorial Children's Village really takes a lot of the brunt of this turn against US-funded humanitarian institutions. In December 1950, the PRC cuts off all foreign humanitarian aid, and they're focused most especially on American humanitarian aid. And the People's Relief Association of China, this newly funded social welfare body, starts sending out investigators to investigate all these orphanages that had previously relied on foreign money through the adoption plan. And when they get to Chang Memorial Children's Village in Chongqing, they're pretty appalled by what they find. They see these Chinese children carrying around pictures and letters from their American parents. And they say that this is causing them to look down on their fatherland and lose respect for their own nationality. They even quote this one child who apparently told the investigators, "I would rather be an American's dog than a Chinese person." And they use this evidence to say that the adoption plan is harming the thinking of China's children and causing them to forget their own fatherland. And this ends with these investigators leading the children in a mass denunciation meeting, a 控诉会, in which they're asked to criticize their foster parents and these humanitarian programs in which they participated. And Xiang is actually one of the first children to speak. He said, "Before, I didn't know that they'd come to poison and deceive us, and I even thought that they'd come to give us help and be good to us. Only now do I know that Saunders, the head of the orphanage, was an imperialist element who insulted our dignity and poisoned our character. I truly hate him." And after he spoke, Xiang was asked to walk in front of his classmates and actually tear up the letters and photos from his foster father, a man named Gio, in Perry, Georgia. And then his classmates followed suit, so that you had sort of literally the ripped remains of the adoption plan piling up by the fistful on the ground beneath their feet. So what are these organizations to do? This is when they all move out of China and really start redistributing humanitarian aid according to the new political logic of the Cold War. I think China's Children Fund is a really good example. Like AOFA and others, is kicked out of China in early 1951 and quickly remake child sponsorship into an amazingly effective global humanitarian program, really focused on sort of US Cold War allies in East Asia. You can see Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, and Taiwan in these early years account for 80% of the total enrollment in the adoption plan. And I think Taiwan is probably the clearest case where you can see how Cold War politics, more than humanitarian need, really comes to shape who is getting aid. CCF really wanted to open 2 orphanages in Taiwan, but they had this problem in that, as their person on the ground in Taiwan said, we're in a place, they were in Taichung, that really doesn't need an orphanage, right? And they're saying it doesn't seem right to take children from good homes and put them in an institution just because they're orphans, if they were staying with families or relatives. So why, right? Why do this in Taiwan? I think this propaganda poster calling Taiwan the most anti-communistic spot in Asia makes the sort of underlying Cold War politics quite explicit. They say, Russia did not supply the rice in this child's bowl, nor did the communists in China. America supplied it. And it's also in these cases, particularly in Japan and Korea, where they start moving on from the adoption plan for international child sponsorship to legal international adoption. And although legal international adoption gets a lot of attention and a lot of controversy during the Cold War years and up to the present, it's really child sponsorship that becomes the most successful fundraising tool for private humanitarian aid around the world, first in East Asia and then in Africa and elsewhere, and remains so to this day. So to quickly zoom out and conclude, right, what new do we learn about the history of humanitarianism when we tell it in this way, right, from the perspective of these individual children in China? On the one hand, I think we get really a totally new genealogy of global humanitarianism itself that makes it clear that humanitarianism, as it globalized, was not just an expansion of Western imperial practices, but really ran through China and Chinese diasporic organizations. Finally, I think we get sort of this insight into this overlooked phenomenon of how and why global humanitarianism became so intimate, right? How ideas like child sponsorship and adoption became the most powerful fundraising tools for private aid as a way to help people navigate the sort of everyone, everywhere, all at once problem. And finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, we see that in contrast, right, to this common critique of humanitarianism as a tool of imperialism. As valid as that critique might be, I think we see how writing these histories from the archives of sort of Western organization has caused scholars to really overestimate how successful these groups were at actually imposing their own narratives and their own agendas on the recipients of aid in places around the world. In fact, at least in the case of China, it was often the recipients of aid who were really able to shape its practical and political uses. I think children played key roles, right, as letter writers in shaping the meaning of this aid they received, even though their voices were so often silenced or spoken over. So I'll stop there. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
We're okay, Julie? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Why don't we, okay, so obviously a very, very rich book. Also, it kind of remarkable. I've given book talks in the past, and it's very difficult to kind of reduce and like, a huge book into, such a succinct and clear presentation. And I thought that was really particularly effective way of doing so. So I think we're going to open up the floor to questions. I think this is just a really revolutionary book in multiple ways, in terms of its globalizing Chinese studies, but it's also rethinking global humanitarianism. It's also really intervening in affect studies, and then kind of rethinking, sort of that early moment of the Cold War, like, sort of how do we think about that too. So I have lots of questions, but maybe I'm gonna open it up to the floor first. So why don't we raise and introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Dan, and my question is sort of in the third part of your presentation when you were talking about the revolutionary purposes of global humanitarianism. I thought it was really interesting how the PRC wanted to use their letters to spread communist propaganda and sort of promote China's ideology, but they also were cognizant of not wanting to go too far and not trying to alienate the foreign sponsors with being too strident. But my question is, I'm assuming since these orphanages were run under the auspices of the People's Republic of China, which was obviously known as a communist organization, the people, or a political organization and government, that the people, the foreign sponsors who were contributing to and adopting these children, I'm assuming, even though they were Western in many cases, they were probably pretty leftist, pretty left-wing, probably communist sympathizers, if not communists themselves, I would imagine. I don't think there's any big secret that that's, who they were donating to. That's the children in the country they were donating to. So why did the government feel the need, or the people that were running the orphanages for the government feel the need to sort of dial it back or tone it down for fear of alienating them? Or is it just that the Westerners who were donating just thought they were doing a good thing and didn't really have a political perspective, or at least not one in terms of their donation?
That's a great question. Thank you, because it's this really complicated political moment where a lot is changing so fast, in part due to sort of censorship under the nationalist, right? Because a lot of these orphanages plans started in China in 1947. They've been doing this letter exchange for a couple years, right, before they can kind of openly embrace revolutionary purposes. A lot of it is kind of underground. So you have children writing these kind of vaguely leftist letters where they talk about social inequality and a lot of sort of criticism of the authoritarianism of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists and how children are suffering, but really don't embrace any explicit communist themes. And I think that kind of mirrors where planned politics was at the time. It's coming out of the Spanish Civil War and these United Front movements where you get a kind of generally left-leaning sort of liberal humanitarian vibe, but often not communist and sometimes still explicitly anti-communist. And so they're trying to, I think, navigate these sort of big tent United Front politics and really try to sort of push the limits. On the other hand, after the revolution, you're seeing in sort of mainstream media in the United States and Canada and elsewhere where these donors are, very sort of negative coverage of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think they see this as one way to sort of, on this kind of very intimate level, push back against that narrative and show people a different side of the communist revolution than they might have been sort of seeing in the American press. But I think on the one hand, they're worried about pushing the politics of their donors too far left. Are they really going to support, kids openly praising Stalin? On the other hand, they're worried about these programs getting shut off altogether, right? Will the broader organizations allow this to continue? Will the US government allow this to continue if it just sort of becomes too openly pro-communist propaganda? And actually, when Plan leaves China, it's interesting. Plan itself, which by this point had moved from Spain and was now based in New York, actually cut off the program to China before the Chinese Communist Party kicked off all foreign humanitarians. It was Plan and not China that pulled the plug. And the sort of legalistic argument for doing so was that they didn't want to work with any foreign governments because they were a neutral humanitarian organization. And under the PRC, all humanitarian aid had to run through government institutions and then be redistributed according to need. And that sort of violated the letter of Plan's charter. So they used that as an excuse for cutting it off. However, they then moved into Korea, where they were also working with government institutions. So they were selective in how they applied that. And Plan ends up taking a much more conservative turn after that. But for some of the more conservative organizations, like the one funding Chang Memorial Children's Village, they sort of consistently would make this argument that the children aren't communist and we can't abandon them, right? We need to keep sending American money, have American foster parents, sending letters, and let them know that this sort of, free world exists outside of China. So they actually made this anti-communist argument that continuing these things is good for America, it's good for the free world, and they actually stick around until the end, until they are predictably kicked out by the Communist Party. So I think if you pinpointed this really interesting moment when a lot of politics around humanitarianism are in flux in China and around the world.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was so interesting, and I really learned a lot from the talk. My question is about translation, and I found that the letters that you showed us, and also the way that the difference between the Chinese and the English really highlighted a lot of the issues and the themes that you were exploring, which was really fascinating. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about the nature of those translations. So who is doing the translation? How is that sort of part of the method of these organizations? And I was also really curious about the difference between the handwritten original letters and the typed translations. And on the point of intimacy, that seems like that's a really interesting and important issue. And then the third question that I had about this is the dominance of English. So maybe this is sort of selection bias, but it seems like some of the other international donors came from non-English speaking places. And so I'm wondering if English is kind of the dominant international language here, or how maybe other languages might have participated in the problem of translation.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. Those are really fascinating questions. Maybe let me start from the handwritten versus typed issue, because I think this is really interesting. And I mean, as you can see from the talk, in almost all cases, I was able to find both literally stapled together, right? The handwritten original and the typed translation. And that's because they sent both in almost all cases to the foster parents for exactly the reason I think you surmise, that the handwritten letter was such a sort of symbol of intimacy, right? Sort of the only physical impression of this child who you're in a lot of ways building these fictive kinship ties with, but will never actually meet. And so they really appreciated, I think, the power of the handwritten letter. And you actually see cases where I think there's one woman I talk about in the book, Bethia, who just wrote these very, very effusive letters and would say, just, it moves me so much to have a letter written by your own hand. And she said she actually pressed it to her face at night and she could feel him far away. So they definitely appreciate that. And then, and then I think the sort of explanation from these kind of colder typed letters. You could certainly see how even if you didn't know Chinese, maybe you have a friend who does, and you could get caught out in a mistranslation. I never saw any examples of that happening, but I'm very curious whether it would have. In terms of how they did the translation, it's interesting because during the World War II era with the NARC, it was so ad hoc, right? These orphanages are moving every few months as the Japanese advance, and they're really just trying to find anyone, either a teacher at the orphanage who maybe studied abroad, or sending them back to Chongqing, where sort of Song Meiling and these other very elite, largely Western educated women are working to do translations. And in those cases, actually often would actually, in the process, rewrite out the handwritten letters in Chinese, which is why some of those I showed earlier, you can tell are like clearly not an 8-year-old's handwriting. They've been transcribed and kept in an archive in China, whereas the real letter written by the kid was sent abroad and I don't have access to at this point. And so there, I think they're kind of, I'm gonna use this term of sort of translation as a tool of translingual intimacy, where I think they're trying to sort of get at, based on studying abroad or sort of their cosmopolitan backgrounds, the kinds of stuff they think a sponsor might want to hear versus not want to hear, and sort of very inconsistent practices in that regard. By the post-war years, it gets much more standardized. The Plan China branch actually had a 3-person translation team based in Shanghai who did all of it, the head of which was this guy named Lu Ping, who ends up becoming quite famous as like the PRC's lead negotiator in the handover of Hong Kong in the 1980s. And his background was translating these kids' letters in the 40s, where they have the translation department is producing reports and sort of very systematized what can be said, what can't be said, what we're going to censor, what we're not going to be censored. So there's a process of formalization. And then the dominance of English is really interesting too. I only ever found letters either in Chinese, in those cases sent to like basically a Huaqiao in Southeast Asia. Although in some cases, I think elite Huaqiao in Southeast Asia also wanted to write in English, I think is a sort of cosmopolitan marker. There were groups in France, there were groups elsewhere in Europe where I imagine maybe they were using other European languages, but all I ever found in the archives were English and Chinese. Yeah.
Quickly, I'm gonna, we have one question. Let me just take a few from the audience and then get also online. But Yingchuan?
Thank you so much for talk and congratulations on the book. So I think I have 2 broad questions. So first, building on what Alison just said, was China unique in this? I mean, in terms of using local agents and using translation as a form of political censorship, or this translingual intimacy, as you term it, was China a unique case? So I assume probably not. So if so, what made China and Chinese children competitive in this humanitarian competition that you were talking about? And second, I see this book as primarily a history of global humanitarianism as you introduced it. So can you also elaborate on your intervention to the historiography of modern China? So I think I'm specifically thinking about Jenny Chen's book, which touches on similar topic, but also there's a recent, strand of scholarship on this international or this transnational fascist connotation of the KMT regime. So can you probably maybe also comment on that thread of scholarship as well?
Thanks so much, Ngron. 2 really good questions. On whether China was unique, it's a great question, and one that I don't think I'm going to give you a satisfactory answer to, just because of sort of my training and my background and my language skills. I did this as a China project. I would love to see people build out similar kinds of research in Korea, in Japan, later as these programs move into South Asia and Africa, to see whether, particularly as you move later in time, there's more travel, there's more technology, whether there's really the same space to express local agency as there was in sort of World War II and the I guess the immediate post-war period, the Civil War era in China. If nothing else, I think China was probably uniquely early. The child sponsorship as sort of a concept has long histories, actually both in sort of Western philanthropy and sort of variants in China, where we have this like Renyu system, right, where people in like the Jiangnan region are sort of sponsoring individual children, although there's no contact with them. And then missionaries going back to the late 18th century sort of use these ad hoc sponsorship programs, but they were never able to systematize it. Like the first instance when you actually get regular contact between children and people overseas through a sponsorship program is China during World War II and in the post-war years. So if nothing else, I think working out how the personalization of humanitarianism changed its political possibilities gets worked out first, I think, in China at this moment, in large part because, of what I was arguing at the beginning, that there was no built-in colonial logic for why anyone should be donating to China. You didn't need these programs to get funding to, say, British colonial India or French Indochina, because you could appeal to the responsibilities of empire, right? Since no one was acknowledging the sort of inherent connection to Chinese children, I think they needed to innovate and create these personal ties as a way of creating an obligation to China. Certainly these programs expand globally, and I would love for people with different language skills than me to really follow up on that question of how it continued to transform in other sort of historical and geographic context. In terms of the interventions in modern Chinese history, it's a great question, because I think you're right. I think my sort of original purpose in doing this project was really to speak back to global history trends and these histories of humanitarianism that were being written essentially exclusively for Western archives, and to ask sort of at a very high level, if we really go deep into, a lot of this is Chinese municipal archive research into Chinese archives and look at these programs from the other side, what new do we learn about global history? But I also think there's a lot to say in terms of modern Chinese history as well. One is the sort of rise of children as political actors and as transnational political actors. I think there's this kind of period that starts around World War II with children as people's diplomats and really continues through like the Little Red Guards and the Cultural Revolution, where it's this idea that children are sort of capable of acting out politically and representing China on the world stage, I think is quite interesting, and I think emerges out of these programs. What other interventions do I want to highlight here? The other one I might highlight here is the way that transnational projects that start during the nationalist period get repurposed during the communist era. I think it's really interesting, right, that the communists take these humanitarian programs that they very easily and later actually would dismiss as just the American imperialists and the nationalist reactionaries doing their thing, and try to repurpose them for revolutionary purposes. But in terms of sort of the material practices, in terms of the networks of who's running these orphanages and who they're linking with abroad, you see a lot of continuity. And even after they get shut down, it's sort of a really interesting question, right? All these Chinese people employed by these humanitarian organizations, what do, right, after the Korean War when they're all shut down? And interestingly, so many of them actually go into the international propaganda industry. They start writing English language propaganda magazines like China Reconstructs and distributing them around the world. And so I think you can really see how sort of Mao era internationalism is in a lot of ways built on practices and institutions inherited from the Republican period. Hi, Will. Yeah.
Hi, Jack. Terrific talk. I learned so much. I think is really amazing. Two questions. One is about the archival research that you did. Just talk a little bit about that process of going into these municipal archives. How did you, I imagine there are tons of letters. How did you decide what to focus on and how to sort of narrow your scope? The other is, are these child sponsorship programs continuing? I imagine they are, but how are they impacted by the one-child policy? Did that change the types of letters that were written, or did that affect the actual programs and how they were run? Did they encourage more sponsorship as a result of that? And how did that how did that affect the programs?
Those are great questions. Thank you, Willie. In terms of archives, just sort of as a matter of logistics, like I started working on this like in the US. I was taking Eugenia's class, and so I was really limited to working with the US side archives at first. So I worked with it actually at the University of Rhode Island is where Plan donated their archives up until the 80s. China's Children Fund, now Child Fund, is based in Richmond. So I had a lot of the US side archives about what they thought they were doing in China, where they thought the money was going, how they were narrating things on the American side. And then so in my first visits to China, I was like, okay, right, if you're this organization that claims you built 60 orphanages throughout China, right, there've got to be records of that in China. So a lot of it was going to municipal archives. I did 5 cities, Guangzhou, Nanjing, Beijing, Chongqing, and Shanghai, to sort of track down one, where the money was actually going, how it was being talked about, and how it was being used on the ground in China. And so a lot of these orphanages were responsible for submitting reports to municipal governments. And then in Chongqing, so the nationalist government moved to Chongqing during the war. There, a lot of it was at the national level as well. So a lot of the NRC stuff is actually in the sort of national level archives of the Republic of China in Nanjing, and really just trying to sort of piece together the American archives, the Chinese archives, see what was consistent, and then where these sort of fractures emerge and you start seeing a different picture. And a lot of it was just like really like individual case studies. Like I had this one, like that story I told about the kid who ended up dying in the Korean War. I'd seen his letter and his case file in Rhode Island, at the University of Rhode Island, and then was able to track down what happened to him at the Shanghai Municipal Archives, where there were a lot of records of this orphanage, including alumni many years later in the 80s, sort of writing back to find out what happened to their classmates at the orphanage. It's sort of like name by name, kid by kid, trying to piece together stories across the two sides. And then in terms of the one-child policy, this is really interesting because I think, so these organizations leave China in 51-ish, they go to Korea, they go to Japan, they get really into legal international adoption, particularly Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, sort of initially targeting the mixed-race children of local women and foreign soldiers. But then the one-child policy, which, you know, as everyone knows well, creates this problem of sort of basically abandoned baby girls because their parents, you know, wanted, if they could only have one kid, in many cases, wanted a son. And so it's in response to that, these organizations actually turned back to China for the first time in about 40 years. But at this point, instead of doing child sponsorship, although there actually is some child sponsorship in China in the 90s and early 2000s, we're looking to legal international adoption as a solution to this problem. But interestingly, China also sort of sees this as an opportunity to do people's diplomacy. You know, the trips that, you know, families make when they go to adopt a kid in China were very highly stage managed. They were all based at this one hotel in Guangzhou, the White Swan Hotel. They would get a Barbie doll holding a Chinese baby. It's called Taking Home Barbie. They're like $300 on eBay. I've never had enough research funds to buy one. And then would later organize these homeland tours, right, to bring children and their adoptive parents back to China and sort of build these cultural connections. I mean, there's all these groups. There's one in New York, Families with Children from China, who have very close ties to different parts of the Chinese state, promote Chinese culture. And from China's perspective, this is a way to sort of counter anti-China narratives in the American press. So I think from the donor's perspective, this is totally different, right? One is sending money in the letters abroad. Another is literally bringing someone into your own home as a family member and a legal commitment. But I think from China's side, this idea that this was a way to sort of do people's diplomacy and international propaganda was something that, you know, has remained until the recent ban late last fall.
Thank you, Jake. I learned so much too. Actually, you just started answering my question. I wanted to ask about what does it mean to foster a child and about the parents and the selection. For example, let's say a family has a lot of sympathy to offer, but not money. Could they offer sympathy through letters? I mean, on the one hand, it's a very capitalist project too, right? So I was wondering what we learn about, you know, fostering kids.
That's a really great question. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. I think the short answer is no, right? These programs were expensive to run. A sort of enduring criticism of child sponsorship is how high the overhead costs are, right? Even just getting paper and ink during World War II was a huge challenge, not to mention cameras and photographs. They kept it up because they couldn't do fundraising without it, right? If you weren't getting the photographs or the letters, people dropped out. But the overhead was so high that I don't think someone saying, you know, I want to exchange letters but won't donate would have worked. There were pen pal exchanges that were organized in the Civil War period, but they largely targeted sort of middle schools and elementary schools, so sort of a more elite kids anyway, where there was a cultural exchange aspect, I think divorced from the humanitarian aspect. For these programs, I think the overhead was so high that really if like regular donations weren't coming in, they would be losing money on these programs. In terms of what it meant, it's very varied because there's an unevenness in the relationship in that the children were required to write. Some Like NARC was once a year. By the Plan China branch, it was once a month. They were required to write a letter. The Western donors can write or not write as they please. You had some who were sending like 5, 6 letters a month sometimes, who were writing these very emotionally exuberant, sort of long letters, almost like they were offering like this correspondence course in everything one of their sort of biological children would know. And others who seem to never write, which there's some awkward cases in the archives where we have a kid writing like, this is the 5th letter I've written since the last time you've written me letters. You know, all my friends at the orphanage are getting letters back and I'm getting really depressed. And so it's very uneven, right? You know, to what extent, so I think like the promise of this intimate tie through fostering was what gave it the fundraising power. Children were obligated to participate. And I think on the donor side, you really see the whole range from, you know, they wrote a check and they kind of forget about it, to like really deep emotional investment. It also gets gendered in interesting ways. China's Children Fund marketed a lot to single women and women without children to be like, you know, school teacher or, you know, female doctor, like you can experience motherhood through the experience of child sponsorship. So I think the marketing started to sort of play into these gendered stereotypes around fostering and parenthood as well.
So we have one question online from Margaret Tillman. So thanks so much for this great talk and book. You make a really wonderful point about overseas Chinese communities as important for fundraising. And I know that you've also written about remittances. Could you speak more to the role of overseas Chinese and also perhaps different types of fundraising and solicitation among Chinese versus non-Chinese abroad?
Thank you so much, Margaret, for tuning in. And that's a fantastic question, because I think there's a sort of essential relationship between remittances and humanitarian fundraising that comes out in World War II. So I think there's a lot of people will know, you know, going back to like the late 19th century and the self-strengthening movement, you know, the Chinese state, beginning with the Qing, really saw Chinese abroad as a source of money for sort of modernizing projects or welfare projects, right? You've gone abroad, you've made some money, even if you're just an ordinary labor, right? Well, you send back money to help us modernize, to build roads and bridges and orphanages and hospitals, et cetera. This really gets pushed to the brink during World War II. I think there's a lot of celebration in China about how sort of overseas Chinese were so key to funding the war of resistance against Japan that they donated truly enormous sums, in some cases adding up to like 1/5 of the total government budget during the war. A lot of that was actually coerced. I think, Margaret, this is the chapter that's still waiting to come out that you referenced about how the nationalists would work with sort of pro-KMT diasporic organizations in Singapore and New York and elsewhere to really force people to give these donations. They were in a sense in sort of an extraterritorial tax where like Chinese employers would literally just take 10% out of your income and send it back to China for these wartime causes, which was causing enormous financial hardship on Chinese all over the world during World War II. And so they're kind of pushed to the brink in terms of what the diaspora can actually support financially. And I think it's in this context where the KMT really through songmailing and the NARC reimagines the way that the diaspora can sort of help the motherland do fundraising, right? It's not just by sending money back directly. They get it, sort of, we're squeezing you for all you have already. It's going out into your local communities in sort of New Zealand or New York or wherever you are and getting sort of non-ethnically Chinese local people to donate instead. So they sort of, I think the diaspora shifts during World War II being from a direct source for remittances to another source of humanitarian fundraising. I think that's where a lot of these kind of adoption programs get innovated. There definitely is a difference. Like the NRC in its fundraising in Southeast Asia, a lot of those numbers, like you're seeing so many people from Indonesia and Singapore and elsewhere, a lot of that are actually European sort of colonial populations that are being targeted in those places because mostly ethnic Chinese populations were remitting money through other means. There was some overseas Chinese who participated directly in the adoption plan, in which cases I think the sort of the patriotic rhetoric was a little bit higher. There was less focus on letter exchange, although there was some letter exchange, either translated or not. I guess what I would emphasize is a sort of key shift between sort of the diaspora as sending back money directly to the diaspora as going out into the world, making Chinese children a humanitarian cause and serving as fundraisers themselves.
So Ziqian, go ahead. Yeah, and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, so thank you so much
Thank you. It seems that the project itself, comparing to your introduction to the overall like humanitarian efforts prior in the quote unquote semi-colonial period of China, the NRC project seems like an effort for the nationalist government to like trying to impose some of its influences into this humanitarian, like by establishing like a nationalized, a nationwide and quote unquote like probably official sort of humanitarian like agency. So I would be curious about like the extent to which it was a success. Like what is the result of that, and also like as we all know, the entire sort of humanitarian sector after 1949 was really like the PRC was really doing a great, not like probably not great job, but they were really nationalizing it. They were putting like everything under the control of the national like Red Cross and all the other government institutions. So that was highly nationalized. So what was the extent of an NRC, and how did it interact with, for example, other private religious sort of humanitarian efforts existing at the time?
That's a really fantastic question. Thank you. The NRC is such an interesting organization, and one that I hope continues to get more sort of exploration both in Chinese history and in global history. I think there's different ways that we could measure success and how much it was nationalized. So you're right, it's sort of a kind of semi-official organization. Song Meiling is the official head. It's also a United Front organization, so like Deng Yingchao and other sort of prominent communist women are a part of it, although much less sort of involved in the day-to-day. But sort of nationalist finances are so strained, right? They're already sort of, so desperate to get money from abroad as well, that only about 25% of their money is ever coming from official sources. About 75% of their money is coming from private sources, and the vast majority of that from abroad through the adoption plan. So I think they're quite successful at fundraising. They're less successful, I think, at making this a centralized national government effort. In terms of, at their peak, they sponsor 61 orphanages. They call them baoyuan, or sort of orphanages. That's impressive, right? I think that's an impressive accomplishment. Tens of thousands of children survive the war who might not have otherwise survived the war because of it. But in terms of the scale of suffering and disruption, I think that's really a drop in the bucket, right? The number of children who are able to make it into these orphanages is so tiny, right, compared to the number of children who would have benefited. And sort of to return quickly to the issue of gender, what's interesting is they're almost all boys. It's actually the opposite of what you see in the 90s and 2000s, in part because if you can only save one child, get one child into an orphanage, you are more likely to send a son. So there's a gendered component there as well. But I really think, so, I don't know, impressive accomplishments, I think a drop in the bucket of aid, but I think also really pioneering, and it's a sort of proof of concept, right? That sort of the promise of an intimate relationship could work as a humanitarian fundraising tool. So it's other more institutionalized humanitarian organizations like sort of Child Fund and Plan and later World Vision, who I think really take, and some of them connected with the CCP, who take a lot of these sort of fundraising ideas that the NARC had but could never fully implement, and I think have really profoundly shaped humanitarian fundraising around the world today.
So I have a question, well, two. Yeah. They're kind of related to this question of genuineness or authenticity. Yeah. So the first one is, one of the things that I find so wonderful about your work is that it sheds light on the work of making intimacy, right? And far-flung intimate ties, right? So global intimacy. And you show all of the rituals involved, including the writing the letters, choosing of the right, phrases, making sure that the hand is there with the written letter, so that the, Hilda receives it and sees the little boy actually purportedly wrote it, or that wonderful final mass denunciation, right, where, PRC tactics or CCP tactics of using mass denunciation to move, affective ties away from family to the state, right? That's all about, the mass struggle sessions, right? That is being literally used in these orphanages where the little kid has to actually tear up the letter, right? That real ritual act of ripping asunder the original affective tie. So you use the term fictive kin, and fictive relations, but I'm presuming that you're using that in the sense of, that's how it's conventionally used, right? But because much of what I see your work doing is actually looking at how genuine different forms of affect can be, non-biological ties, these school marms who are probably very lonely might become very, very affectionate to these little boys they never met, right? So this is not even a question. I think this is more just what I actually wanted to, do you highlight this in your book? Because I see this as a huge intervention in affect studies so that you could make one. So that's one issue. And then the other thing goes back to how you kind of present, so it's also a question of authenticity and genuineness. Like you present this issue of, you're doing this, looking at humanitarianism from the bottom up. And you want to bring in the child's voice, or not even voice. I mean, I want to, well, or what are you looking for the child voice, or what is agency for you? And what's authentic agency, right? So in the sense that, like, what are the interests of the children, and you as a historian, how do you get to the genuine interest, or can I even say that, right? I mean, the one instance where I thought that there was one true, genuine expression of the child's interest was in that kid ran away and they had to find somebody to replace him, right? That was like the unruly, like moments of unruliness on the part of the child. But, I wanted to ask, and this was a translation question, right? Or a couple people brought up the issue of translation and or even like of the coaching. And you actually said at one point that the children are obligated. So how authentic are these voices, even those handwritten letters, right? I mean, how can you as a historian get to, they're, at a certain point, they're all standardized. Other points, they're being coached, right? How do, 6-year-old kids who are being forced to write, right? I mean, this is all layers down. You have, where's the child, like, what are the children? The money is not going to them, right? So what is the agency? Actually, the agency seems to be those moments of unruliness when they go off script.
Thank you so much, Eugenia. Those are great questions and important issues. I think they're actually quite related. So let me start with maybe the kind of like the institutionalization aspect. And trying to boil this down into, I think I got close to 45 minutes. I kind of skipped over this part. There's a chapter in the book called sort of Institutionalizing the Intimate Turn, which looks at the NARC was very not institutionalized. They were sort of fly by the seat of your pants organization that really looked at China's Children Fund and how they took that proof of concept and tried to institutionalize it. And in doing so, we're amazingly concerned with sort of markers of authenticity. They had just this ever proliferating series of rules about the letter writing and exchange process. On the one hand, I think shows that people weren't following the rules, right? Otherwise you wouldn't need them, but also shows how much they sort of cared about communicating authenticity. So there were rules about, for example, standardizing the romanization of the children's names, right? They were often very sort of unstandardized so that someone wouldn't get a second letter and think, is this a different kid? When the children signed the translated letter, because they would sort of sign their name at the bottom, they had to use the same pen or brush or ink that they'd used for the original letter. They did things like not dating the letters, because it often could take 6 months, 7 months, 8 months to get them actually, delivered to people. And so to not call attention to those temporal gaps, they forbid the kids from actually dating them. And then rules like one kid can't write out letters for multiple kids. Everyone has to write to the sort of own ideas. And I think, actually sort of a question Willie asked, I found 546 of these total. They're generic, but literally no two are the same. There were no, in those 546 letters, no two were identical. In part because I think they were so obsessed with, at least the idea of authenticities, because it was so core to their emotional power and sort of creating, as the word you use, sort of all these rituals that make, I think, fictive kinship in sort of the anthropological sense, not necessarily not genuine. I think in many ways, the institutionalization was essential to their affective power. They probably would not have worked as well or been so, so effective in eliciting sentiment and donations if they weren't so institutionalized. In terms of like getting down to sort of children's voices or agency, it's tough, and I don't claim to in the book, but I think what I try to do is make all the ways in which these letters were mediated. There's so many levels of mediation and intervention, to not let that be sort of an obstacle to analysis, but make that the object of analysis in itself. So you can use translation as sort of one way of sort of reverse engineering processes of censorship, looking at these proliferation of rules. And then also these moments of unruliness, right? The children running away, either because they didn't have enough food, or in many cases because they wanted to join the war. They had such a patriotic education. They were 13, 14. They didn't want to be in an orphanage. They wanted to be out fighting the Japanese, the nationalists, the communists, whoever it wanted to be. The off-script letters as well, they're the excessively leftist letters that get focused on, I think, in the archives. But what I found is the more common sort of off-script letter was ones that just ignored politics altogether. Just being like, here's what I did today. There's one that I like to quote a lot that's in the book where this girl just wrote a poem about a fan that she made out of paper. And they were translated and sent abroad sort of dutifully. So a lot of kids didn't participate in the politics, and they still ate at the orphanages. Their letters were still sent abroad. So if nothing else, I think it's clear that you need the active participation of children for people's diplomacy to work. So yeah, I think that's how, in their role as letter writers and sort of these letters as physical objects, the photographs, sort of were incredibly important. I think what's in the children's heart, I think is sort of an unknowable question, although sometimes I feel like you can get a sense from like which letters feel generic and phoned in and which letters feel authentic, at least. In part, it's the letters that complain, right? Like, you haven't written to me to 6 months, I'm feeling depressed. Like, that's probably not the stuff that's made up. But to me, it's really looking at how sort of these institutions mobilized children as political actors and used all these letters of mediation as opposed to sort of what's in the children's heart themselves. Yeah.
If I may ask
Yeah.
a question. So, well, thank you for the fascinating talk. I look forward to learning more about the history after this and by reading your book. You mentioned, how in the early 50s, some of these foreign-sponsored organizations just laughed through certain excuses. Others were kicked out, or at least the one that is in Chongqing,
Right.
Was basically like kicked out or terminated by the state. I'm wondering, was there ever a debate within the PRC government as to were there ever anyone who advocated for the continuation of such program? I mean, I'm thinking about this one just because of the sheer number of children who might need help, and what the PRC government thinking about their own capacity to take care of these children if they had discontinued this. And secondly, I think conceptualizing these, even in the early 50s, were there people within the government thinking about these organizations as potential tools for either political or even financial purposes, because the PRC in the 50s and even in the 60s and the early 70s were really starved of foreign currency. Because I suppose people from overseas were sending foreign currency. I don't know. I was just curious whether there were people who were advocating for the continuation of such institutions.
Sure. That's such a smart question. Thank you. Absolutely. There was actually a pretty vigorous debate that really came to a head in like April 1950, which is when they founded the People's Relief Association of China. And the two sides of the debate, just like to put figureheads on it, it's basically Song Qingling, who's advocating for continuing these programs. She had really close ties to Plan through the China Welfare Fund, which also did a lot of global humanitarian fundraising. And she's basically making the two arguments you laid out. One, we need the money, right? There's a drought in 1949. There's all of these children who are in orphanages. There's also widows and schools and all these other kinds of programs funded by foreign aid. And she's like, are we really going to have the first year or two of our governance to be all these people let out on the streets because we're cutting off the money suddenly? And then she makes this people's diplomacy argument. She uses that term, and she really holds up Plan specifically as the sort of model of a people's diplomacy, sort of revolutionary humanitarian institution, to say we can make ties with people. This goes back to Willie's question, or I think Danny's question at the beginning too, who want to support us, right? Who are already supporting these programs. We can sort of tell a different story of China abroad, that this has, beyond just sort of the need for money and aid, that this has real potential international political benefits. The other side of that, there's a few people, Dongbi was probably the most skeptical in April 1950 of saying, no, like more orthodox sort of Marxist, this is imperialist, even if they have good intentions, this is making us dependent on American largesse, right? We've got to cut these off, take over the orphanages at the state level, and sort of create independence in terms of social welfare. Temporarily, Song Qingling wins that debate. She wins over Zhou Enlai, and like the Plan China branch gets permission to continue. China Welfare Fund gets permission to continue. In a way, the debate gets overtaken by events with the Korean War. So in December 1950, it's actually the U.S. who moves first in freezing all sort of like Chinese assets in American banks as sort of a wartime measure. And then Zhou Enlai and the communists respond by freezing American assets in Chinese banks, which immediately cuts off, right, the source of funding. So the money's not there to begin with. And so once that happens, sort of Song Qingling's side kind of loses out. And then they start sort of re-narrating this ideologically as embracing this as like, Wenhua Di Guo Zhuyi, it's, cultural imperialism, it's all of these things. But in a way, the choice was made for them by the Korean War and the freezing of assets. And so I think, who knows in an alternative history without the Korean War, I think one way or another these programs were going to get cut off. But that sort of lively debate in which I think the continuing humanitarianism side was really winning, sort of just gets subsumed by the Korean War and made a moot point. And then Song Qingling kind of rebrands herself in a sort of internationalism divorced from humanitarianism. Yeah, great question.
Okay, I think we're at the end of our time, and let's give Jack. Yeah.
Hi, Kaylin. I don't know if we have not seen each other in person for a while. So with the press, I work with Jack on the book, and so I just say hey.